Lepp, who's an associate professor and chair of gender and women's studies at the University of Victoria. One of her areas of research and activism is trafficking in persons, transnational labor migration, and irregular border movements in the global and especially the Canadian context. She's a founding member of the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, established in 1996. GATW Canada is a member organization of GATW, whose international secretariat is located in Bangkok, Thailand, and is comprised of over 100 non-governmental organizations from most regions of the world, including self-organized groups of migrant workers, domestic workers, sex workers, and survivors of human trafficking. Since '97, she's participated in crisis intervention, advocacy, and acted as a principal investigator of a number of collaborative research projects which examine the development of Canadian policies and practices as they relate to human trafficking and irregular cross-border movements.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And very sorry that I missed so much of the conference. Maybe the downsides of being a chair, and I'm not quite sure what the upsides are these days, but one of the downsides is it's difficult to get away. And I just also wanted to say that I was a student of Brian's many, many years ago, and I just wanted to echo what you said about, being given license to do what you want. And I've always, as I gave a tribute to Brian at Congress, but I've always really appreciated his guidance and support. For example, very, very recently, I was under lots of pressure to apply for the dean's position in the humanities at UVic. And who did I ask about whether I should do it? And I got a resounding no over email, and I listened carefully to my former supervisor. So I've been working on migration and trafficking for a long time and sort of have seen the ways in which discourses of trafficking and migration have unfolded, particularly in the Canadian context, but also elsewhere. And the title of this session is Marginality as Historical Subject. It's not, my talk isn't historical exactly, but I think that many of the trends that I talk about could be historicized, and that's certainly a project that someone, or myself, when I have more time and I'm not administering a department, would be able to undertake. So about a month ago, I facilitated a 5-day GATW strategic planning meeting in Bangkok, and the focus was on the current global migration trends. And when we talk about migration, we're talking about labor migration as well as irregular and undocumented migration. And especially the focus was on the migration and refugee crisis in Southeast and South Asia, as well as in Europe and in other parts of the world. And the purpose of this strategic planning meeting was to identify the alliances, and we're an alliance of about 120 organizations worldwide. We wanted to establish the priorities in areas of research, political and policy advocacy, and frontline work on the trafficking, migration, labor nexus over the next 5 years. And one of the key principles that shaped the meeting was toying with or reversing the statement, don't just stand there, do something. And what we told ourselves, don't just do something, stand there. And this, in other words, that this appeared to be a very critical moment to really take stock with regard to the alliance's work globally, as we take a very migrant-centered approach, and we also emphasize the accountability of our work to those who are supposedly supposed to benefit from it, or benefit from our efforts. So we concluded the very first morning of the strategic planning session by concluding that the world is a mess, and that available spaces for political engagement and advocacy in the field of refugee and migrant rights is shrinking, especially in the international arena or in terms of discussions at the nation-state level. And so what is to be done, we ask? So understanding global trends is key to GATW and GATW Canada's migrant rights and anti-trafficking work. And here when I'm talking about global trends, here I'm referring to the crisis of human security, and there is just absolutely no question in the room that there is a crisis of human insecurity, dispossession, and displacement in the world due to the devastating effects of globalization and predatory capitalism, or as one of my colleagues said, capitalism on steroids. resource extraction, agribusiness, we know all of this, land and water crises, environmental degradation, war and militarism, that is producing the surplus and disposable, often stateless population and laborers who are on the move. And many of these stateless populations and laborers or migrants are being evicted from the category of humanity. And what they're simply trying to do is to seek other opportunities or increasing economic opportunities or a degree of physical safety, but this eviction from the category of humanity is a profound one. At the same time, they're also critical to the survival of economies as a source of cheap labor in the global north or in the Arab states, for example, and also in the form of remittances in the global south. For example, the Nepal economy relies almost exclusively on the remittances of migrant workers to keep the economy going. And at the same time, there's the growth of the homeless populations within national borders. There's this really great film called, it's filmed in Delhi, and this is an aside, and I hope it's not taking from my minutes, but it's called Cities of Sleep. And basically it looks at the political economy of sleep in Delhi amongst homeless populations. If you have a chance to watch, it's just extraordinary how, you have to pay to sleep. If you're a homeless person, and there's this whole entrepreneurial and political economy around sleeping, which is a very, very basic. So in 2013, the global migrant population was estimated to be 231 million people, and this has increased incrementally, 155 million in 1990, 176 million in 2000. And about 50% of migrant workers or migrants are women. And just in this last year, our attention has been drawn to the situation of the stateless Rohingya population in Southeast and South Asia, and the refugee crisis unfolding in Europe. And there doesn't seem to be any signs of abating. So in the context of our meeting, it was very interesting that the participants from the global south really laughed and noted that it's very ironic that the global community only deems migration a crisis when racialized people are knocking on Europe's door, when in fact there have been multiple crises that have been unfolding in various regions of the world for decades. And even so, the situation in Europe drew all our attention on Facebook and so forth on the situation in Europe and the Syrian, Eritrean, Afghani refugees there, but it kind of captured our attention for a couple of weeks, and now we've sort of, in North America at least, we've lost interest. So as we know, the response of the national states to what appears to be the ungovernability, that's a hard word, sorry, of human displacement. This is an ungovernable situation of human displacement and population movements, has to impose increasingly stringent immigration and securitization policies, fortress-like borders, to engage in the warehousing of population and refugee camps, prisons, and detention centers in the name of national security and the preservation of national identities. And Hungary comes to mind in that moment, to the hardening of hierarchies between citizen and non-citizen, and between deserving and undeserving. Refugee, economic migrant, legal, illegal, smuggled, trafficked. And these are administrative and legal categories that, and people within these categories have access to different, access to different forms of being considered human, and also access to rights. And I think in the European situation, are they refugees or are they migrants, have had very much to do to whether they would have access to refugee protection or could be deported as migrants. So Canada's history of exclusion has been informed by the foundational violence against Indigenous nations, and its history has been peppered with exclusionary laws and practices against racialized groups. The Chinese head tax, Japanese internment, and the list goes on and on. Since 2002, the federal government has introduced 111 new immigration policies. There were 19 policies passed between 1867 and 2001, so obviously there's an escalation of immigration policies, and some of which were informed by the arrival of the 509 Fijian migrants in 1999. I live on the West Coast, I remember that moment well. And the 492 Tamil refugees or migrants in 2010, both on the shores of British Columbia. And the assumption here, and the response of government here, was that such arrivals were due to Canada's lax immigration laws, generous refugee policies, and poorly patrolled borders. So in the interim, since 2002, Canada has perfected a managed migration system, and the US is looking at our system because it is perfect. On the principle, perfect if you're the Prime Minister or whatever, based on the principles of precarity and temporariness over permanency. There has been a significant drop in accepted refugee claims and permanent citizenship. There has been an increase in the importation of temporary foreign workers from just over 100,000 to about 300,000 over the last decade. There has been a detention of almost 90,000 migrants, including over 600 children between 2006 and 2014, some of who have been in detention for many years, up to 10 years. The deportation of close to 120,000 people in that same period, and not to mention the barbaric cultural practices, political discourse, and the Islamophobia embedded in it. So, within all of this, since the signing and ratification of the UN Trafficking Protocol in 2000, Canada ratified in 2002, trafficking persons have emerged as this semi-protected category. Amongst all these administrative and bureaucratic and legal categories of migrants, trafficked persons have emerged as a semi-protected category within the nexus of transnational migration. And the reason for this is that elements such as coercion, deception, and forms of exploitation such as forced labor are defining features of trafficking, and it's considered a violation of human rights or the human rights of the person. There has also been, in the context of Canada, and this is everywhere as well, a disproportionate focus on trafficking into the commercial sex sector. And there has been a focus on the need to rescue women and youth from sexual slavery, as it's called, and to prosecute transnational criminals who are deemed to be responsible. So in this, and it's embedded in the protocol itself, it's a UN document, all countries, virtually every country in the world has signed on and implemented legislation and policies in response to it. But within the protocol and most national legislation, there's a clear distinction made between sexual and labor exploitation. And thereby there's the rejection of the idea of sex work as work or as an income-generating activity. And trafficking for sexual exploitation is generally defined as qualitatively different and a much more odious form of exploitation, as opposed to the more mundane and economically justifiable forms of state-sponsored or corporate-sponsored labor exploitation. So such understandings, it seems to me, and this is GATW's position, also obscures the role of the state, be it through colonial and immigration policies, labor regulations, criminal laws, criminalizing sex work, or transnational economic policies in the production of the structural conditions in which the exploitation of migrant and sexual labor occurs and is perpetuated. For example, 75% of the world's exploration and mining companies are headquartered in Canada. And I think that, there's been lots of activism all over the world against mining companies and the resource extraction industry. And I was struck by the statistic that 75% of those companies are housed in Canada. Also, there's a very, very strong prohibitionist group, which are groups that call for the eradication of prostitution through criminal laws. And these include modern slavery abolitionists. These are groups who take their genealogical inspiration from the anti-slavery movements, anti-black slavery movements of the turn of the 20th century, correct me, yes, or of the 19th century. And then there are also prohibitionist feminists, they're very strong radical feminist movement against prostitution, and then what some call celebrity humanitarianism. So there's a lot of celebrities that have gotten into the game of anti-trafficking work. And this became very, very evident during the Amnesty International just recently had a huge debate around whether it would support decriminalization and the support of sex workers' rights. And so there was a lot of a global debate around this, and Amnesty International ultimately came in favor of decriminalization, but simultaneously there were a lot of Hollywood celebrities that became part of that debate. So amongst prohibitionist groups, we don't like to use abolitionists because, I would explain that later. Anyways, prohibitionist groups is the argument that all female sex work, regardless of consent or conditions of labor, is inherently a form of coercion, violence, and exploitation, and that all women in the sex industry have been trafficked. In the Canadian context, these latter understandings of trafficking with the attendant discourses of sexual slavery and rescue have become increasingly dominant and indeed hegemonic, particularly among the ever-growing number of NGOs, faith-based groups, and high-profile political anti-trafficking crusaders who have taken up the issue in the last decade. And this in spite of the fact, going to evidence, that most of the temporary workers' permits that have been given out in Canada to trafficked persons have fallen in the category of labor exploitation. So this debate around the conflation of sex work and trafficking, and on the one hand, and sex workers' rights on the other hand, really intensified in the context of the Ontario Court challenge of Canada's prostitution laws in 2007. The Supreme Court struck down those laws, and then the Conservative government enacted Bill C-36, which actually is one of the most repressive anti-prostitution laws in the entire world. And prostitution in this new legislation is explicitly defined as a form of exploitation, and that this law is designed to combat sex trafficking by criminalizing clients and to abolish prostitution. So what we've seen is a full alignment between Canada's anti-trafficking laws and policies and its prostitution laws. So sex workers' rights activists and their allies, as well as migrant justice advocates, have been very, very critical of the anti-trafficking framework or specific iterations thereof, arguing that such conflations really erase or renders irrelevant the intersectional differences among sex workers, all genders, sexualities, indigenous and racialized, migrant and domestic, and their varied and complex experiences and needs, who are working in diverse environments and under different working conditions. But this evidence does not count. It also further reinforces certain hierarchies of deserving and undeserving. For example, transnational traffic victims must prove that they are genuine and not bogus trafficking victims when discovered or rescued, and then would be considered worthy for conditional state assistance. Trafficking has also been depoliticized in the sense that it is often an individualized story about bad foreign people, unscrupulous men, family members, and so forth, who prey on innocent women and youth for profit, without taking into account that most migrants in the third world in particular, including migrant sex workers, must rely on third parties to facilitate cross-border movements. Human trafficking has also been powerfully mobilized in the political enforcement realms to pursue and bolster certain political agendas at the expense of migrant mobility and sex workers' rights. In addition to the example of Canada's prostitution laws as a counter-trafficking strategy, the federal government has established a significant anti-trafficking infrastructure involving key departments such as public safety, justice, RACMP, citizenship and immigration, and Canadian Border Services Agency. And some of the key strategies here focus on securitization and surveillance, detection and prosecution of transnational and domestic trafficker, undercover operations, electronic surveillance, the periodic raids of massage parlors, apartment-like brothels, and even the residences of private sex workers. And also implementing measures that are designed to restrict women's mobility. For example, the eradication of the exotic dancers visa in Canada in 2012. So what I'm arguing here is that even though I was part of the group that advocated for anti-trafficking protocol and the international, I think that this is an example of the way in which good intentions turn into somewhat of a monster. And the other thing that I wanted to say that in the Canadian context, and I'll conclude here, is that migrant sex workers haven't really been much of a focus of attention. For example, migrant rights groups have distanced themselves from the migrant sex worker agenda. Sex workers' rights movements in Canada have focused on domestic workers. So it's only really recently that migrant sex workers have emerged on the agenda, and all the studies that are coming out suggest that the complexity of their experiences do not at all match the hegemonic discourses that are being produced by prohibitionist groups and members of government and in the international arena. Thank you very much.